Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar, Hybrid Cloud Backup Strategies. My name is Leah Troscianecki. I am the Principal Product Marketing Manager on our public cloud team, and I'm joined today by Mr. Rick Vaonver himself, our Senior Director of Product Strategy. Just a few housekeeping items before we get started. Everybody is muted upon entry, so if you do have questions, and we really would love to hear questions from all of you, please use that Q&A function in the chat. Additionally, if anyone has any sort of technical issues, if you cannot hear the speaker well or need assistance, please use that question box as well. We will be monitoring it throughout the session today. We will also stay on afterwards because I'm sure this will generate a lot of really great questions. So let's talk a little bit about why we're here today. First and foremost, we really wanted to land why cloud has become so important in Veeam's talk track around the Veeam platform. Whenever we've done research, whether it's our own research, operating with analysts, talking to end customers themselves, it's very clear that over the last few years, a trend that was already occurring of workloads moving to the cloud and net new workloads being built in the cloud has certainly accelerated. And there's a wide variety of reasons for that. Certainly there's market dynamics in the storage space. The cloud continues to be seen as a much more resilient and, dare I say, secure offering. But what we're finding is that a lot of end users, as they've rushed to get to the cloud, are finding that there's a lot of harsh realities in how they manage and operate the cloud. Namely, how do we remain secure? How do we reduce costs? And ultimately, how do we maintain a total data protection strategy that doesn't leave any gaps in coverage? So we're going to talk about some of those strategies today. How do you optimize, stay secure, and get the most out of your cloud investments? So with that, Rick, let's go ahead and flip to the next slide. What we wanted to land first and foremost is to give you guys a big picture of what the Veeam platform can offer. And we're going to kind of focus on that on two different buckets. The first is protecting, controlling, and managing data within the cloud. Many folks who have been longtime Veeam users, or maybe you evaluated Veeam in the past, have found that Veeam certainly is great for virtualized environments. That's no mistake in our naming convention. But if this is your first time back in the Veeam world, or if you haven't really heard from us lately, you might not know that we've really dramatically expanded our platform promise to include native backup of cloud-based workloads. So whether that be AWS EC2 instances or Azure SQL databases, we truly offer a native backup solution that's easy to manage and standardize across the whole Veeam platform. So we're going to spend a lot of time talking about that cloud native piece today. The other piece that we'll center around is leveraging the cloud for data protection and security. So whether you're sending the backups to the cloud and making sure that they're secure and protected, or you're sending backups to the cloud for archival or disaster recovery purposes, we want to talk a little bit today about some of the strategies that we recommend and ultimately tease some new things that are coming soon in Veeam Platform V12. So with that, let's set the stage a little bit. Let's talk about sort of tell them what you're going to tell them strategy here. So first, I want to talk to Rick a little bit more about backup to the cloud. So Rick, I think you have a really exciting strategy slide that you want to walk our audience through today.
Yeah, cheers, Leah. And the thought here is that to those points you just mentioned, Leah, I'm a person who likes to use the products, and I talk a lot to people who do. And this view here, when we talk about backup to the cloud, and I should really highlight, the cloud is really a model. It's not always a location. And the thought here is there's three things that always matter, any type of storage, right? Latency, capacity, bandwidth, etc. So what we see here is that object storage, a relatively new storage model on the market, it hits really well in the bandwidth and the capacity side of the equation, and it doesn't always outperform the latency side of the equation, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. And the reality is, with internet connectivity, you can really, cloud to cloud, entertain some incredible bandwidth conversations. Yet the capacity is, dare I say, approaching unlimited, but it really removes a lot of the boundaries of traditional storage, right? I've spoken to some mathematicians and they're like, no, it's not unlimited. But for those of you who manage on-premises unified storage, there is a capacity conversation, but the whole nature of object storage allows you to live in a much more barrier-free world of sorts. And then object storage sits, with a lot of quote unquote coverage in this kind of view here. And then let's talk about file systems. Now, I'm also kind of working backwards from new to old. And in the middle are some, higher end file systems. They follow a bandwidth prescription on the top axis, really limited by an on-premises network stack. We can't practically obtain the cloud level of bandwidth and things like that. So we have barriers when it comes to networking on file systems, and then capacity to the right as well. It really comes down to how much you purchase. In fact, one of my earlier in my career management mentors used to say, coming up with the money for the storage is the problem, right? Coming up with the storage isn't the problem. But nowadays, it actually is the problem with supply chain challenges. So it used to just be, I used to say, coming up with storage isn't a problem. Coming up with the money for the storage is the problem. Now, actually, both of those can be sometimes part of the problem. And the cloud can alleviate some of that, or at least object storage technologies in general. But file system storage systems can provide really good latency conversations as well. And then we can talk about block storages, which can actually, especially if we go into some of the full all flash type systems, have very good, outstanding latency performances, but much like file systems, are limited to a networking stack on premises, and the capacity is even more of a conversation about that upfront investment and I don't want to say just the really limited and structured amount of capacity, that sometimes you reach limits of what the systems can do, whereas that's just not really a frequent conversation with object storage. And so the real takeaway here is that object storage, and this, okay, I'm no analyst, but there's a lot of coverage of what object storage brings. And like I said, Leah, I talk to customers and partners all the time. This is what they want. They want more object storage options. They have enjoyed what we've done over the years with our tiering, but they really want to double down on that object storage scale out model for the backups. And we can still do all the good things like tiering and 3-2-1 rule, and immutability is easier than ever. And I think it's a very opportune time. We had some research that you shared earlier, but what are we going to put in there? And I think the hybrid cloud, there's a lot of different services that come to mind.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, certainly Veeam, again, as I said earlier, has been known for backup of virtual, but over the last few years, I think we've really been expanding our reach, because what we're hearing from end users is that they like our sort of comprehensive policy-based approach to backup, and they want to make sure that as their workloads move to other locations, they can. But Rick, as you mentioned, the cloud is not monolithic. It's not this sort of one size fits all, be all end all story. There's a tremendous amount of complexity and customization within the cloud. And certainly as you look at multi-cloud, the true multi-cloud world that we live in today, where most end users leverage at least two of these services, it becomes really important for a vendor like Veeam to offer support across these sorts of services, especially if you want to consider having the same kind of granular and full-scale recovery that end users expect from the on-premises piece. So it really falls on us to work with vendors like AWS, like Google Cloud, like Microsoft Azure, to leverage their APIs and build a true suite of offerings across the services. And we continue to add new services as part of this equation. These are the services that we currently support, but as we'll continue to tease, we certainly have some amazing launches coming up early next year, and we continue to add services to the portfolio so that as workloads move from on-premises to the cloud and transform from VMs into right-sized services, whether that be platform as a service offerings, file storage, you name it, Veeam is starting to build truly native and customized offerings for these services. And I think that breadth of coverage is going to continue to be part of Veeam's DNA. Something else that's part of Veeam's DNA is recognizing that as workloads move to the cloud, workloads are probably moving across clouds too. So I did want to tease a bit of research that we just released called the Cloud Protection Trends Report. And within that report, we surveyed backup administrators as well as cloud administrators. So whether that be IaaS admins, engineers, architects, we surveyed organizations and these users specifically and asked a variety of questions. But in particular, I wanted to highlight this one, which is, has your organization brought any workloads back from a public cloud host to an on-premises offering? And there's some of the natural answers for that. Yes, we had a disaster recovery scenario and we pulled it back on-prem. Yes, we do dev test. We develop in the cloud because of the elasticity and the ease, but then we bring it back on premises. But what's been unique about this research, and I think again, as we continue to expand this research to include more cloud personas, we're seeing a lot of these end users identify saying, you know what, we migrated to the cloud and it didn't quite work for us. Whether that be because the latency wasn't what they expected it to be, or because they had bill shock. They realized that the cloud can be quite expensive sometimes. There's a variety of reasons why some of these scenarios have occurred. And so it's going to continue to be a really important part of Veeam's DNA and what Veeam wants to offer to end users, this idea of portability, of being able to get out of the cloud to exfiltrate, to either go to other clouds or bring it back on premises. So we're going to talk a little bit about more of this strategy and how Veeam delivers on this sort of promise. It's not something that users have to think about on a day-to-day basis, but as you're evaluating and designing or architecting even, it's really nice to know that you have an exit strategy and that backup can be a part of that. So that's some good setting the stage content, Rick, but I think now we wanted to get into some exciting topics. So first, what we wanted to do is talk about leveraging the cloud for secure backups. And security continues to be a really big part of Veeam's story. But I don't really think this is just a messaging story. I don't think this is a FUD story. This is really something, I think Rick, you and I can attest to this, having talked to customers and partners quite a bit this year. It's coming up a lot in conversations. And in fact, even when we're chatting with partners or chatting with prospective Veeam users, we're finding that a lot of the time in the purchasing decision, someone from the security team is involved in this discussion. So we want to make sure that you guys have the tools that you need to evaluate where your end-to-end security strategy as a company fits into a BCDR strategy. So let's start with our first kind of discussion of topic, which is using the cloud for immutability. And so to define immutability, what we mean by that is being able to secure that backup and make sure that any sort of cyber attack isn't also infecting the backups, because ultimately your backup and recovering those backups should be your last line of defense, but you need to make sure that it's not a part of that defense strategy, right? That it's something completely separate. So Rick, do you want to talk a little bit about Veeam's current immutable strategy and then maybe some fun things that are coming in our next launch?
Yeah, and you're right on point there, Leah, that it does come up every single time I talk to customers and partners. And, you know, right now today, there are, I want to say 24, 25 different, you know, we call it Veeam ready object with immutability storage partners. And I think it's really important to highlight that number because, well, there's not 24 or 25 hyperscale public clouds. This very much is a technology that can be consumed with on-premises unified storage. It can be consumed from hyperscalers, you know, dedicated service providers that focus on this type of thing. And of course, like Amazon and Azure, for example, Google doesn't offer it currently, but this is something that comes up every single conversation. And this is one of those absolute must-haves. And, you know, the object storage implementation of immutability is very attractive for us because this is a really good control plane barrier. You know, the Veeam software writes this data in with immutable parameters to these object storage providers for backup data. But the good news is like a threat actor, so the security angle comes right up. You can't do anything with it, even if you have all the Veeam passwords. It's a whole different control plane. So I'd argue it's more secure than what other market implementations have. Given the criticality of the data, you're right. Secure backup is that last line of defense. So that's where we are now. And going into the future, we're extending it. Derek called immutability everywhere. We're allowing that first stop to be immutable object storages with V12. We're allowing more workloads to go there as well. Big request from the NAS products, for example. So big step built on a very proven identity. And one unplanned nugget I didn't rehearse with you, Leah, I'll share is that when I debriefed from our support team, it's like when we have a copy in the cloud that's immutable, this is a very good sign when it comes to like ransomware response and things like that. This is the way, just to harness my inner piece of advice to you. Immutable storage in the cloud is the way to be resilient.
Yeah, I mean, frankly, when we talk with security professionals about building a response plan, it should be included, and often is when we've spoken with them, that calling your backup vendor is part of that response plan. And so I know, Rick, you and I have talked with our support teams before, and it's really common to get a call to say, hey, we've had a ransomware attack. It's part of our plan to call you guys. How can you help us? Well, Veeam launched immutable backups several launches ago. And so we really want to continue to spread the word to make it clear. The time is now for you to be setting that plan, because I'm sure I could pull up right now 12 different stats that will show you that ransomware continues to proliferate, and Veeam is here to help. It's a given, as Rick said, that it's part of the equation. And with that, let's go ahead and flip to our next topic too, which is immutable backups within the cloud. Rick mentioned that coming in our next version, we're going to be extending the support of immutable backups to more workloads that live in the data center, live in the edge, but we're also extending that to our cloud native workloads as well. So if you're running Veeam backup for AWS, Veeam backup for Microsoft Azure, you're going to be able to back up those workloads directly into an object storage repository that has immutability as part of it. So in Azure, it's called immutable storage for Azure Blob. In AWS, it's called Object Lock. And so ultimately, again, we continue to work with these cloud vendors, whether it be the hyperscalers or the whole slew of object storage vendors, to continue to build these integrations and make it as easy as possible for you to bake this into your security strategy. Rick, anything to add?
Well, I think it's important to highlight the within the cloud part of this, because we talk a lot about, we definitely are living in a hybrid world, but when we think about the market as more and more cloud native deployments exist, right? Ransomware isn't just a PC problem, it's a data center problem. It absolutely can happen in the cloud. And there's a lot of safeguards that are provided in the cloud to prevent these things from happening. But in the end, if it gets in, the way out is an immutable copy. So this is just yet another way that we can provide this high level of resiliency. And people who are doing a lot with Amazon and Azure, for example, this is very much top of mind for them. And when I think about the conversations I've had with our product manager on this particular capability, it's kind of a short conversation. It's what I mean by that, typical Veeam. It's just a checkbox. It's easy to use, and we're not going to, overwhelm it with complexity to get this outcome of immutability.
Yeah, and a theme that we're going to talk about a little bit later is this balance between making things really simple, but ultimately recognizing that the threat landscape we live in, the sprawl of data that we live in, is incredibly complex. So how can Veeam take that responsibility of making the complex simple? Where we're at right now is it's not going to be simple, but we are going to try to make it as comprehensive as possible. And I think as you're looking at our immutability story, comprehensive is probably the main adjective I would love for you to walk away with, because you're going to be able to build an immutable backup strategy into almost anything you're doing. And I think that's really exciting, again, as we look at the threat landscape, because it can come in from anywhere. And now you have the opportunity to recover from it and have that ultimate fail safe for resiliency. So with that, Rick, I think let's flip a little bit. We're going to stay in the cloud and talk a little bit more about some best practices. Now, ultimately, there's nothing new and exciting coming in the next launches that we want to tease here. But for those who maybe are thinking about launching some sort of data protection for your cloud-based workloads, something that's new for folks trying to do this in the cloud is recognizing that you have to go back to basics sometimes. So in cloud, we talk a lot about this concept of logical separation. When you're running backups on premises, it's natural for you to back up to a different server, for example. Oftentimes that's because you don't even have space on whatever server that native workload is running on. And of course, there's a tremendous network of server storage offerings that you make it really cost effective and do data deduplication. There's a whole industry around that. But as you're looking at the cloud, you have to really build some of those basic best practices into your motion. And Veeam tries to make that a part of our user experience as well. So supporting multiple accounts, for example, multiple subscription offerings, backing up into different regions, right? So that you have that threat resiliency across regions of the cloud. Ultimately, though, I think what we're trying to do in this session is give you guys as many best practices to think about as possible as you're looking at your 2023 planning. So logical separation, it seems like it's a given, but ultimately I think it's not when we've chatted with customers, especially customers who are maybe new to Veeam. Maybe they are on the cloud side and they're looking to implement Veeam because their organization uses Veeam for on-prem and it's a natural extension to bring it into the cloud. We have to talk about some of these basics. So Rick, any kind of basic backup tips that you want to leave the cloud folks with?
Yeah, you're right. It is back to basics. And I can't emphasize this as important enough. Example, I recommend your backup data be in a designated Azure account or AWS subscription.
Yep.
And the only purpose of that is the storage service. So an S3 bucket or an Azure storage account with, a blob container. And then on the other side with, the S3 bucket with object lock compliance mode engaged. And really the only purpose of that account is to hold the backups, because the whole nature of the cloud, as you know, is stand stuff up and tear it down, stand it up, tear it down. You don't want someone to accidentally discard or reconfigure critical bucket.
Absolutely.
So, and that same goes for the cloud native side, right? If we're backing up a production estate in EC2 and RDS, let's put those backups in a different account. And the products Veeam products currently support multiple accounts, right? So this is an absolute best practice, highly recommend. And I spoke to one customer who actually took this advice. They doubled down on it, went to the next level. They actually put the backup account, this was an Azure organization or a Microsoft Azure type of customer. They had hybrid stuff. So they had on-premises infrastructure, they had public cloud infrastructure, and the Azure storage account and the subscription that held the backups was even removed from the whole parent organization. It was a credit card account just for that level of separation. So I was like, hey, +1 for that. That was smart. So, and what really is the takeaway here, Leah, is just flexibility. Whatever the requirement is, we can really implement that with the current products, and it's only going to get easier as we go.
Yeah, and I want to twist deeper into that access management piece of it as well, because certainly I've spent my whole career in the cloud in some way, shape, or form. Identity and access management is just a part of our lives in the cloud space. And it is in data protection as well. So ultimately, I think Veeam continues to be really committed to supporting, separation of access, least privilege access being a given in not only the way we construct and design our products, but also how we recommend them being implemented. So whether that's using something like role-based access control baked into our products, whether that's integrating with things like the Azure and AWS key services that are offered, we want to make sure to continue to have that as part of not only our Veeam strategy, but supporting this secure backup promise that we want to offer. And so, Rick, I don't know if you want to tie that back into what we were just talking about around best practices and any sort of customer stories, but I think this continues to be a big one that we're really committed to.
Well, indeed, and it almost is part of a broader security conversation. And if I were to take one of the smaller things associated with our next release is around multi-factor authentication, for example.
Absolutely.
That's also a good thing. And then one step into the best practices world, think about your cloud accounts. Those as well should have the multi-factor or two-factor type of authentication as well, because nobody wants to be the next leaky bucket and things like that. So yeah, this is something, again, back to basics, and Veeam's here to help orgs through the journey as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And Rick, I think I included a slide after this to just kind of land this point home. And again, what we're hoping to do with this webinar is give you guys some things to think about as you may be preparing for the upcoming V12 launch. What are some things you can do now to prepare yourself for that launch? So when it comes to identity and access management and ultimately logical separation, these are some things that we recommend really thinking about in the design and implementation of your backup. So thinking critically about identity and access management, credential auditing, that's something that not a lot of folks do, especially if you're doing a simple integration with your Active Directory, for example. You may need to routinely audit to make sure that the right folks continue to have access. We're big fans of role-based access control, RBAC here. And again, as Rick mentioned, we're going to be continuing to expand our multi-factor authentication support. Ultimately, when it comes to backup to the cloud, backup of the cloud, think cross-account, cross-region, and potentially cross-platform. Again, we mentioned that we offer a tremendous ecosystem of object storage support, whether that be Wasabi or a vendor that you might run on premises as an object storage offering. So thinking about that, really having that sort of resiliency and threat tolerance as part of your planning. These are some really good things to think about and to take a look at your strategies. There's always never enough time to do all the right things and cross the T's and dot the I's. But even if you just do kind of a rundown of this list, I think it's a really great place to start. And again, to prepare for what's coming in the next launch. Rick, anything to add before we go to our next topic?
Well, just, take this far and wide. Here's one practical tip example, and take, for example, an Azure storage account. If you know that only your on-premises infrastructure is going to be putting backup data into an Azure storage account, you can put in a firewall rule that'll only let storage access go from that IP address of your HQ or things like that. Little things like that, it almost becomes a mathematical thing that just calculates your risk down, right? So I highly recommend just thinking about the access, thinking about both on the cloud side and the Veeam side, right? And I've also started talking to a lot of organizations removing internet access from critical systems, So these types of best practices end up giving you a mathematical advantage to your risk footprint. And this is just a great starter list. And speaking of numbers, one of the things that always comes up in the cloud, Leah, is cost.
Yeah, I mean, certainly it's a balance, right? We want to do all of these best practices and cross our T's and dot our I's, but that can get incredibly expensive. So certainly here at Veeam, we continue to be really committed to trying to do everything we can to reduce costs. Before I do that, I do just want to remind everybody that we do have the Q&A open. So if you have any questions, if you have any ideas that have been generated based on that previous discussion, or if you really want to talk cost, please go ahead and use that Q&A function. We're also going to chat a little bit later today in the next steps section about ways that you can connect with the broader Veeam community and continue to share best practices. I think that continues to, again, be something Veeam wants to really promise to our end users, is to cultivate a community, because at the end of the day, there's 27 million different ways that you could do this, and they're all probably valid. So it's a great opportunity to share stories and ask questions within the community too. So we'll throw up a link where you can chat more about that with some fellow end users. But with that, let's bring it over to cost, because as everybody is working on 2023 planning, cost continues to unfortunately be a very big part of our discussion. And for those of you who are maybe looking down the barrel at having a hard time getting access to storage, certainly we have a lot of strong relationships within the channel. We're very aware of the wait times to get a lot of the storage offerings that you need. Object storage might be the way that you turn in order to not only get available storage, but to also reduce your costs. However, as Rick mentioned at the top of the call, there's a time and a place to use object storage, and Veeam continues to be really flexible in how we offer that support. So Rick, do you want to talk a little bit about why and when to use object storage? Maybe you can tease a little bit about how we've been interacting with object storage using scale out backup repository, but maybe even where we're going with the next launch.
Yeah, so I think the why is, when you need some of those capacity things, a lot of people have used it for the offsite element of the 3-2-1 rule implementation. A lot of people in the Veeam world used it for immutability, right? So those were just a few reasons. And then on top of that, well, maybe I'd rather have higher performance but shorter retention on premises and go deep and wide forever in the cloud. And to play a little bit on the iconification situation, right here, the little kind of archive class storage, that's another way to kind of help address some of the cost. And what I mean by that is those archive tier type storages can really drive down the overall cost by having ultra low cost, for that long-term retention. And then this is taking a look at a technology at Veeam that's been out for a very long time, the scale out backup repository. Okay, here we go. It's a software defined secondary storage system at the management layer that can do policy driven backup storage management. Whew, it's a mouthful. But the reality is this technology is super resilient. Every copy, and it's not practical for an organization to use all these different combinations, but this is a look into the future where V12 will have the performance tier support object storages with immutability, and then the capacity tier yet with immutability. And I've already given the little lock seal for Azure because we do expect the development goal is to have Azure blob storage in the V12 release. It's implemented in the last 2 betas. It's always a good sign. And I've tested it. It works pretty good. And if we look at this, the copies that we'll have, every single copy is fully self-describing. That is so important, Leah, because if all else is gone, if all we have is a backup in a bucket, Veeam is good to drive complete recovery without any prior knowledge of the infrastructure, without any catalog, media server, those types of constructs. And then if you think about this life cycle, right now in the V11 world, the performance tier is like disk, block, file type storages. That doesn't go away in V12. We're adding object storage to the performance tier. But if you think about the performance tier, the capacity tier, and the archive tier, this solves a secondary problem related to our theme of cost, which is you never want to have to choose between total cost of your backup storage and your compliance of retention. This logic makes it so easy to put the older data to meet that retention requirement into the right class of storage. And the last thing I'll hit on this is that there is, the middle bullet point, space efficient, doesn't give it enough language here. There's what I would call cloud economic intelligence going on here. Veeam will transparently put data into these object storage resources in an efficient manner, keeping in mind egress costs. But then if you go, say, from S3 to Glacier, we actually change it again to be, say, a 500 meg block into Glacier storages because the egress time, the egress costs, we've done some modeling that if you have a larger amount that you retrieve, you can reduce your API costs. And these are little things that we do transparently to make it efficient for people who use the products here, both on the performance, on the reliability and durability for sure, but also, I like your phrase, what you call it, bill shock? We want to avoid that. Bill shock, it's a thing. It's a thing.
Especially in cloud, it's a thing, right? Because at the end of the day, we try to provide calculators, and certainly the cloud vendors do as well. And you can do the best you can to plan, but at the end of the day, one change to a setting can dramatically change what you expect to spend. So when it comes to optimizing how you use object storage, one of the main things I want to talk about here is really sitting down, looking at the applications and the data that you need to support and get serious about retention. Because back in the day when everything just went to tape, you were writing once, seeing it never again, but it also didn't cost you anything to just sit it in a storage locker, take it to somebody's house. If you were doing it well, maybe it went to Iron Mountain. But now that we're talking about storing in the cloud, you have to really get serious and get critical with app owners and line of business owners about retention policies. You might even need to get really close with compliance teams to make sure that you're meeting minimum requirements and then knocking it out the door. So we actually recently, as part of our cloud protection trends report, surveyed, again, backup administrators, IaaS admins, et cetera, asking them, how long do you typically retain data for any given workload? And when I create a pie chart based on those answers, it's almost every color in the crayon box, which to me says ultimately we have to, as a Veeam backup vendor, support not only lots of different retention policies and kind of plan for every scenario, but also, as Rick hammered home several times, that transparency piece, giving you the tools that you need to be able to effectively set those policies. Because again, one flip of that policy switch and all of a sudden you could be spending a lot more. Same thing with immutability, right? I mean, depending on how you execute that immutable storage, it could add additional dollars to your plan. So it's really important now that we have some of these really cool object storage enhancements coming, new support for Azure Blob immutability, new offerings to be able to just go directly to that performance tier for object storage. Plan it out now. Which apps are going to be cost cut? How long are you going to keep something? That's a really big part of the plan. Rick, I know I kind of hammered home retention points a little bit here and mentioned that we do have some really nice calculators that can help with cost modeling. Do you want to talk a little bit more about ingress egress fees, retention limits, like anything you want to add here?
No, just that we look at kind of some of the practical points here that we have.
Yeah.
These come up, and the bill shock. These are the things that go into it. And my advice to the market here is, play with this, test, do a proof of concept. More specifically, make a cloud economic model of what you're going to do with the cloud, and make sure your implementation on a small scale matches your expectations and aligns to your cost model. Because if it doesn't, and then you've implemented, it's too late.
Yep.
And then you are talking bill shock, and then we're in a scenario of moving things around. And again, back to my other point, never want to have to trade off compliance and retention for for cost, right? And then the last thing I'll highlight, at least specifically on the bottom, ephemeral instances on the other, I love that, the ephemeral instances, because that's a secret weapon in the sense of, like when I mentioned that object storage in the capacity tier gets basically retranslated to a different size into the archive tier. That's the magic that makes this happen, right? So all these little things, I call it cloud economic intelligence, not a marketing approved phrase, but that is the reality, is that we've built this into our strategy here and our implementations as well. And then my professional advice is really think about cloud economic models. And that's not a skill that, a lot of us grew up with, but
Right.
the practical way to do it is to do a POC, a proof of concept with what you're doing in the cloud, and make sure the model matches the expectations, because if you implement it wrong, then it's too late.
I mean, the good news is about the cloud is there is that inherent elasticity. There is the inherent build and tear down, as you said. So it is easier to do testing than it would be on premises, dare I say.
Indeed, indeed.
Absolutely. Well, let's talk about one more use case for the cloud and a way that we could recommend that you have a more predictable cost, let's say, when it comes to this. For my whole career, folks have been coming to us and asking, how can I leverage the cloud for disaster recovery? Because at the end of the day, we recognize best practice is to be ready to fail over into a secondary location. But to do that in actuality is incredibly expensive and not always compatible, right? It's not always easy for you to port something on premises that was built for that kind of storage type and bring it into the cloud. Oftentimes that's not a like for like scenario. Veeam's answers to that for a long time has been our network of service provider partners. A lot of these service providers are built on VMware Cloud Director. So for those who are running something on premises in VMware, it's really easy to actually fail over that kind of workload into the cloud. And in fact, in the next launch, we're going to be making enhancements to Veeam Cloud Connect to support even lower recovery point objectives. So it's even more possible to think about a DRaaS offering for your tier one most important applications, the ones that you really cannot have any kind of downtime or data loss. You simply would be able to flip a switch, send it to a provider, and again, keep those kinds of storage costs low, because it's incredibly expensive to stand up a secondary site in a FEMA zone away, pay for another person to live in that location. It's much easier to just pay a subscription fee to a provider. So now is really a great time to start evaluating DRaaS providers, because they're going to have an even sweeter offering powered by Veeam. Anything to add to that, Rick?
Well, the one thing I'll highlight is that there's two things that make this more attractive than ever. One is built on some proven conversion techniques. Like right now today, we can take physical workloads, restore these as virtual machines, which could then make it fit into these DRaaS models a lot easier. But the other side of it is, sometimes you have to call a disaster what it is. It's a disaster. And when organizations do that, they might think, oh, I'll just go to the cloud today. But maybe they're part of that 45 and 49% who made a change after the decision. And the reality is lift and shift is a lot of change, especially if you're not prepared for it. DRaaS providers specialize in this. They have experts that can help you get the networking right and the security right. And so it becomes a lot more attractive, from the model of what you're declaring a disaster of, to help it run successfully right away. So I think a lot of people underestimate that, but that's just one observation I have, that the networking and the security kind of lend themselves better to this model for on-premises workloads that call the disaster a disaster.
And certainly cheaper than trying to hire that on staff. That's for
Oh
sure.
yeah, and the money, always with the money.
Always about the money. Well, speaking about the money, I think we want to continue to prove that Veeam is the best investment, best horse in the race, as we say. So let's talk about topic 3, which is how we make complex things feel simple, but ultimately operate in this sort of comprehensive world that we're being demanded to live in. Because as workloads move to the cloud, data protection can't change. As ransomware becomes even more proficient at getting in and causing havoc, we need to be comprehensive and make sure that there is no gaps in coverage, and you can truly trust on standardizing in Veeam. So let's talk a little bit about standardization. Ultimately, Veeam for the last several years has been expanding its workload coverage to include more, whether that be network attached storage, Linux machines. Microsoft 365 continues to be a fantastic offering that's a great crown jewel in our cap. But ultimately, I think the reason that it's helpful is because you can standardize your practices, standardize your plans even. Again, we talked a lot about 2023 planning. So whether that be a policy-based approach to retention, to recovery points, whether that's making sure that there's no workload left unattended, making sure that, again, you're improving your threat matrix kind of across all of your workloads, regardless of where they reside. There's so many benefits to standardizing. And we're going to talk a little bit more about the sort of day 2 operations side of things, how standardizing unlocks the ability for you to do cool stuff with your backups. But Rick, if we keep it to kind of the basics of threat management, standardization, cost control, like we just talked about, what are some of your kind of silver bullets, if you will, of when somebody says, why do I need to standardize? Why can't I just use dedicated products for the specific thing I'm trying to back up? What's maybe the thing you kind of offer from a storytelling perspective?
Well, it comes down to familiarity. I know in Veeam product world, I mean, we have different products for different use cases. Make no mistake of that, right? The M365 experience is, different, but not unfamiliar. okay? And with Veeam products, I've again gone rogue, made up another phrase. There's a lot of what I call shared technology between the products, which is just that. That's what makes it familiar. You know, if you're doing a Microsoft Teams restore, it actually isn't too far off of a SQL database restore with these explorers and things like that. So that in the end will boost an organization's confidence in what they're backing up that they can recover. And the throwdown here is that there's very few that platforms that Veeam doesn't protect now. And that's a good thing. The platform is real and it is broad and it's really ready for everything to help not just reduce the complexity and the usage, but just the number of tools. I mean, IT is complicated enough. Backup doesn't need to be part of that complication.
Absolutely. And bringing it back to access management for a second here, that's also what's kind of nice about the standardization story is as workloads move to different locations, you might want to give limited access to an app owner or to your AWS engineer. And having one place where you can manage everything and maintain those best practices, but still give people the right level of access, that's something that you just simply can't manage at scale if you're talking about multiple point products. So I think that's a really great point is the familiarity of one solution, but still being able to open it up to dedicated end users as needed. But let's talk now about that day two operations piece. I think Veeam continues to invest in amazing tool sets like Veeam One. That's certainly a favorite amongst those of us who work on the products team. We love talking about Veeam One. And then we've also, over the last few years, continued to develop a solution called Veeam Disaster Recovery Orchestrator. Both of those solutions are certainly going to have some major improvements and enhancements in the next versions. Rick, do you want to talk a little bit about why monitoring and orchestration should be part of this conversation?
Well, the main reason is the amount of workloads and different data types. It's just too much. And what I mean by that is I talk to organizations, there's just a certain amount of gravity of what they have that the time it takes to prepare for an incident simply isn't tenable to do it by hand. And the only practical way to achieve that is automated testing and automated execution of the, failover and the disaster event. And so that's where that orchestrator product really will shine. But I also feel that it solves a big problem in just the visibility. Like, in fact, my favorite part of the orchestrator product, I know there's a lot of cool stuff coming, Leah, but my favorite part is something that's been out for a long time, and it simply reports on the RTOs and the RPOs. And the single day that we creep over from the expected RTO and RPO of being met, that's raised in visibility within the orchestrator product. That's incredibly valuable to an organization. If you tell the business it's going to be 1 hour recovery time based on a 4-hour RPO, that's what they're going to expect, if not more. And then on day 95, when the data size has crept up and a couple new apps have come into the fold, and we're now talking about these RTOs being out of the expectation, having the visibility, just the monitoring on this is just so critical. And then getting in front of these types of things can make a big deal. Those are wow factor things for your stakeholders in my professional experience.
Oh, just in your casual light experience, no big deal, nothing to really listen to here.
Yeah.
Well, speaking of that experience, I want to flip over to another topic, which I've sort of vaguely referred to as making flexibility work for you. As somebody who's in the marketing side, I do get sensitive to us ever using the word flexibility, because if I were in, let's say, an enterprise organization with lots of different business owners that I have to account for, and I'm constantly being measured, flexibility sounds scary to me, because yes, that sounds nice, but that also means that I'm gonna have to do a lot of thinking and a lot of planning and a lot of working. But I think when we mean flexibility at Veeam, we really feel more it's important to have our offering be able to customize for your needs, but we're still thinking ahead and trying to do everything we can to make it easy as possible. So Rick, I know that there was a lot you wanted to say about this topic of why flexibility is such a big part of Veeam's DNA, and maybe some kind of bits and bobs that we can tease the team with.
Yeah, so I mean, the flexibility part is really about our integrations. I'll go one step further on the DNA and say partnerships are in Veeam's DNA, whether it's those service providers we just spoke about, the hyperscale public cloud providers, a lot of the storage platforms, virtualization platforms, operating systems. There's a lot of what I would call northbound and southbound APIs and integrations that truly make it transparent for the market. And this flexibility to change platforms, to move data from one system to another, you kick one storage vendor out and change out for another because maybe something's up on lease and you're standardizing. Just transparently, we can, not miss a restore point and move the backup data very easily, right? These are the types of things that when people get their head around the scale out backup repository, around the direct restore technologies, around the integration with object storages, around the, Veeam Explorer for storage snapshots across the board, left, right, up, and down, it becomes a really incredible platform for the needs in the market. So I could go on and on about that, but the flexibility is really central in the products for sure.
Certainly. And I think part of our silver bullet of trying to make this work for you too is a lot of our community elements. So we're getting close to the end here. Rick's going to talk a bit about how we support the community of end users. So that's something to kind of keep in mind too. But before we do that, I wanted to talk about one other piece of flexibility and bring it home to a piece of research I highlighted at the top of the webinar today, which is all around portability. We continue to recognize, especially in the last few years, that workloads not only move to the cloud, but it may not be exactly what was designed. It may not have operated the way you wanted it to, and therefore it needs to move to a different location. You have to have an exfiltration strategy. Portability will continue to be part of Veeam's DNA, and when we speak with end users, this actually becomes one of their favorite parts of the product. It may be a little challenging when you're looking at it because you might be looking at Veeam against somebody who's built on an appliance or a SaaS offering in the marketplace or a vendor that's okay having 27 million SKUs on their SKU sheet. But the nice thing about Veeam is that from a licensing perspective, from a storage perspective, and from a file format perspective, everything can really be portable. So whether it's using that Veeam Universal License to unlock protection of NAS, of Windows, of Azure, you have the ability to portably do that simply. You also have, again, that flexibility of storage, whether that's storage on-prem, moving something to object storage, moving something to the cloud. And then finally, the VPK file format being portable continues to be something that not everybody needs to use on a day-to-day basis, but just knowing it's there is a great piece of that insurance policy. So with that, Rick, I think that's what we wanted to talk about as far as how you can optimize your hybrid cloud strategy with Veeam and prepare for the V12 launch. But preparing is a big part of this. So do you want to highlight a little bit about how we can help the community get ready?
Yeah, indeed. And so this, Leah, by the way, thank you so much. Great content here. And that leads me right to what I think is what you can do with this information. And I want to draw everyone's attention to community.veeam.com. This is a relatively new web property that we have at Veeam. And there's 4 things I want to highlight. One is that there's user groups around the world, including those in local languages, right? So if you are looking for a way to engage great technical discussions and shares, that's the place. It's all in the community site. And then there's also some Veeam events, our user groups, and then also some topical things get promoted. And I'm going to be putting more V12 stuff in there. And the third bullet point, the blogs and podcasts, that's a great set of resource. And I want to highlight V12 content is already out there. We, I don't know if we went rogue, went smart, went intentional, but we let some of the Veeam 100 members, some of our best community fans, we've been, sharing V12 with them for a while. There's I don't even know how many V12 posts are out there with a lot of the vanguards and legends already sharing their favorite parts of V12 and walking through how to use it. That stuff's already out there. And then also some discussions, everything from how do I upgrade and more that could be discussed out there. And a promise to you One of the things I did with V11, which was very successful, is I made what's called an upgrade center, which is everything you need to know on how to upgrade. Everything from your, making sure you have your license, your config backup. I walk through an upgrade so you see what it looks like. All that kind of stuff will all be at the Community Resource Hub. So my thought, Leah, is if people want more, there's more to be had. So yeah, that concludes our content. We've processed through the Q&A here quite a bit through the session. We've been taking turns when one's talking, one's typing, that type of thing. And so many people have worked to bring this content to life to you. So a big thank you to the global Veeam marketing team to help on the operations and promotion, the Veeam global product teams who have helped, get the message and the story right. And then, of course, thank you for attending. I know your time's valuable. So that concludes our broadcast today. Thanks for watching, everyone. And that concludes our webinar.